Thanks a lot. That was another great video that covered a wide variety of topics, but they're all centered around about how do we keep our forests as forests, because they provide all of these values. So it covered, again, a wide variety of conservation and management, from very specific discussion of protected areas, the core that provide that context of the iconic places here we have in Michigan, to a variety of techniques that are meant to be broadly applied across this working forest, this production landscape. And so I want to dive into a couple of those, but I liked where we ended up with Charles there talking about, well, what do we do now? Where are we now, and where do we go well into the future? But Bill, I think first, for people and for myself, to understand these forest management, these forest conservation practices, you have to first understand the ownership and the lay of the land. So what's that look like both across Michigan and across the Northern Great Lakes?
That is fundamentally important. So who owns our 20 million acres of forest in Michigan? Well, you and I own the majority of those. 50 to 60% of that is owned by non-industrial private landowners, hunt clubs, family farms, family forests. That's by far the largest landowner of our forests. And then we're very fortunate in Michigan to have public forests. So we've got 4.5 million acres of forests that are state-owned, and there's 3 million acres of forests that are federally owned. So the public owns a considerable amount of those forests, and then investment companies in Michigan own a considerable amount. Over 2 million acres of forest is owned by investment companies. Much of that used to be forest industry lands that have now been purchased by TIMOs and REISs, as they're called, investment companies.
So John, I don't think most people realize that last point. So can you just give us a little bit of background, just a little bit more context about a TIMO and REISa and what that means, investment companies?
Yeah, I mean, when I went to work in the forest products industry, I went to work for a paper company. And at that time, the mills owned the land that had the wood that supplied the mill. About 15 years ago, a transition happened in the state of Michigan where investors started to eye those forest lands, and they started to purchase those from the paper companies. And that's a very different landscape. They own those timberlands for a very different reason, and that's to satisfy their investors' objectives. So what's happened is companies like mine now manage those landscapes for the investment firms, and it's really changed the playing field on how we think about forest management in the Upper Lakes.
So that has implications for organizations like mine, like the Nature Conservancy, for your management company, for the state of Michigan. So once we see that kind of ownership patterns, again, we can protect some of the core areas that are so important to all of us. But that has an implication of the type of management we do elsewhere. So I think the video started talking about some stand-level management, some actual forestry practices about how we plan and how we cut and how we harvest timber. So go into those a little bit, John, because you were on the video.
Yeah, I saw that. So about 8 or 10 years ago, the Nature Conservancy actually acquired a piece of property from one of those TIMOs, from one of the investment firms. And at that time, we started to work on a project where we wanted to prove that we can harvest timber, provide a sustainable source of timber to the forest products economy in the state of Michigan, and then have other conservation values. So when we talk about climate change, when we talk about invasive species, when we talk about forest restoration, what we set about to do is demonstrate that we can have all of those values, recreation and clean water, and still have a very viable, robust timber products.
So what actually did you do different?
So, we managed, and we saw in the video that, in the late 1800s, the state was cleared. The forest grew back, and then after World War II, we started to manage those forests. And initially, our focus was providing wood to a mill. So if you had a mill that sawed sugar maple, you tried to grow sugar maple. And so we see species shift and composition changes on the landscape. What we've done is we've gone back into that forest, and we're really trying to focus on biodiversity. So with all the threats that we face with invasives and climate change and all these things, we really need to diversify our forest portfolio. We need as many species as possible on the landscape so that when these changes occur, whether it's invasive species or climate, we have something there to fill the void. If we go down the road of trying to manage for one thing, then that becomes much more risky endeavor. It would be like taking your 401k and investing the entire thing in Facebook. Right? I mean, that's probably not something that you would do. Yeah. So we don't want to do the same thing with our forested resource.
That's a good analogy. Go ahead, Bill.
Well, it's important because we're asked as a public entity, are you managing sustainably? So how do you answer that question? And folks all over the world have asked that question. And one of the ways you do that, Forest Science has really created forest certification. So that's where independent third-party kind of pokes their head into your management and looks at a number of factors and criteria and makes a judgment, are you managing sustainably? And in Michigan, the state forest system, we have 2 different forest certification regimes that we're managing under. So we're what you call dual certified. But that helps answer the question that the public and forest industry, everybody is asking. We are a huge part of Michigan's economy and want to continue to be, but we want to be sure that we're doing it sustainably. That's one of the ways you answer that question.
So that video again did mention certification. So I think across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, there are probably 10 million, 20, I don't know, acres that are dual certified.
Oh yeah, more than 10 million acres, and really, it's a great story for the wood basket of the Great Lakes. We're going to be able to supply raw product to all of the forest industries and ensure that over 10 million acres of that is coming from sustainably managed forests, and that's what society wants.
So again, to me, what we've done there with this certification is kind of elevate the management of all this this matrix of working forest land. So how do you see, how has that changed the work of you and of your employees and of your colleagues? What exactly, as I asked John earlier, what's different now that lands are dual certified than it was before they were dual certified?
There's a number of factors and criteria. I'll speak to some, and John can talk about others. Part of it is forest planning. We mentioned that a little earlier. You need a forest plan. Where are you going to be? Where are you looking to do your management? Can you predict over the next 10 years how much you're going to harvest, and where is that going to be? So we spent a little bit of time actually looking at that so we can answer some of those questions. How much aspen is going to be on the market? How much pine is going to be on the market? And there's a number of other factors and criteria that are a part of forest certification.
So what have you seen different about the management under these certification regimes?
You know, I mean, I think as a private manager, you know, we manage about 300,000 acres of certified lands. And I mean, we do a lot of planning and we think about water and all those kind of things. But another thing that as a private forester that Bill spends a lot of time thinking about is like recreational opportunities. How is the public using the lands that we're managing? You know, what indigenous use of the landscapes that we manage. And so we really sort of open up the tent and bring people inside to talk about management on landscapes where it probably wasn't discussed all that frequently. So I think it's been really valuable as a private forester to really think about some of those other attributes that we talked about in protecting here.
Yeah, so again, to get back to those values we talked about, obviously biodiversity is also a key component of that type of certification regimes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, biodiversity is I think, at the forefront of both certification systems and thinking about your planning and what species you're managing for in the landscape. So.
Yep, very true.
So what do you think, how do we know when these things have been successful? How do we know, I mean, there's a long-term success, right? None of us will be alive at that point, but how do we know when these types of, again, sustainable forest management or certification, or there's also mention of working forest easements, how do we know when these things are working? Sorry to ask that question.
Yeah, no, that's a real softball. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I think part of the story is that you mentioned, you touched on that people are demanding certified product. So I mean, that's part of the story. People want to see that their wood that they're using is being harvested responsibly. So I mean, I think there's a success story there, and the response in the industry has been that we're providing that product now. And so there's a real success there. And you touched on conservation easements. You know, when I think about some of the things that we're trying to do at the landscape level, certification is a really big piece of that conservation puzzle. Because that, you know, when you talk about the management and you talk about the things, that's going to ensure that those forests are going to be there long term and that they're still going to provide jobs and recreational opportunities and those kind of things. So.
And I would say just look at Michigan. We've got a great state, and it's a great working example of how you can sustainably manage your forest, how you can have a robust timber economy that's actually improving. And we're going to move that economy from 14 billion to 20 billion over the next 5 years. We're going to do it sustainably. We've got clean air, we've got clean water. We're the #1 destination for cold water fishery in the world. More people come here to trout fish than any other place. That's a good indicator. That's a good bird in the cage, if you will, for the environment.
So what's next? What's this look like in, I'm asking you to make some predictions, 10, 20 years out? Where do we go? What are we moving towards?
So Bill alluded to growing the timber economy from $14 to $20 billion. That sounds like a lot. So how do you do that? We have a resource in this state. We're growing 2 times as much wood as we harvest annually. So there are people eyeing the forest for opportunities to develop a bioeconomy. So I think there's a real opportunity for people in Michigan to look at our forested resource and look that we have a lot of certified product available in the marketplace. But what we need to do is think about that tree after it's cut down, not cutting the tree down. So is there an opportunity to get industry back in the state of Michigan to make floors and doors and windows and those kind of things? I just helped a son-in-law put in a wood floor in their house, and it was Great Lakes wood floors. It came from Tennessee. Right? They're marketing the Great Lakes. There's a picture of the state of Michigan on this box of flooring, and it didn't come from Michigan. So we need those products to come from Michigan, and that's how we're going to grow the economy.
And so we can always track that back to, again, making sure we're providing all these values along the whole way we deliver our conservation and management.
That's where
resources.
certification comes in. I think we need to develop that certified industry.
Absolutely. Recreation, ecosystem services, all of those important values that are a part of the forest along with the forest economy, that all has to be brought forward together. We can't lose a piece of that along the way.
All right, well, thanks a lot, guys. That was a good conversation. I'd like to just point out that all of these things are in the equation: the conservation benefits, the biodiversity benefits, the clean water, the clean air.